Blood froze faster than snow in Red Hollow, and Charlotte Hayes learned that truth the moment her cheek struck the saloon floor for the second time. She tasted copper. She tasted fear. She heard laughter above her cruel and drunk, and she understood in that instant that not one soul in the frost lantern would lift a hand to save her. The door groaned open. Boots stopped. A voice low as a grave spoke 4 words that would change everything. Prepare for coffins. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The stranger had already decided who wasn't leaving alive. If this story grips your heart the way it gripped mine while writing it, hit that subscribe button and stay with me until the very end, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from tonight, so I can see just how far this story has traveled. Now let's step into Red Hollow, Wyoming territory. Winter of 1887. The storm outside had teeth. It had been howling since noon, burying Red Hollow under a hard, unforgiving white. And by the time night fell, the Frost Lantern Saloon was the only warm light left standing on Main Street. Inside, whiskey flowed loose, and the piano player had long since given up trying to be heard over the noise. Nobody in that room was thinking about the cold. They were thinking about the girl on the floor. "Say it again," growled Dutch Farley, the biggest of Barrett Cole's 4 hired men, his fist still curled from where he'd backhanded her. "Say you didn't touch that payroll box." Charlotte Hayes pushed herself up on trembling arms, blood at the corner of her mouth, her apron torn at the shoulder. 20 years old, and she'd worked every miserable shift this saloon had to offer without a single complaint, without a single missing coin under her watch. She lifted her chin anyway. That was the thing about Charlotte. Fear never seemed to reach all the way down to her spine. "I didn't touch it," she said, voice shaking, but not breaking. "I never have, and I never will." "Liar!" Dutch grabbed a fistful of her hair and hauled her half up. "Mr. Cole don't lose money. Money don't just walk off on its own legs. So either you tell us where it's hid, or we start asking harder." Behind him, the other 3 enforcers spread out like wolves circling a wounded doe. Silas Rourke with his gap-toothed grin, Bill Tanner cracking his knuckles, and young Cody Marsh, barely 20 himself, looking a little too eager to prove he belonged among grown killers. "Somebody ought to stop this," a woman whispered near the bar, but she said it into her drink, not out loud, not where it mattered. The saloon owner, a heavy-set man named Pruitt, busied himself wiping a glass that was already clean. He would not look up. He had a business to protect, and Barrett Cole owned half the deeds in this county, including the one under Pruitt's own boots. Near the door, Sheriff Wade Higgins sat with his hat pulled low, nursing a beer he hadn't paid for. He heard Charlotte's whimper. He heard Dutch's threat. And he did the only thing a coward with a badge knows how to do. He studied the bottom of his glass like it held the answers to every hard question in the world. "Please!" Charlotte gasped, her knees buckling as Dutch's grip tightened. "I swear on my mother's grave I never stole a cent from that ranch." "Your mother's grave don't mean nothing to me, girl." Dutch raised his boot. That was the moment the door swung open. Cold wind rushed through the saloon carrying snow, in with it scattering across the floorboards like scattered salt. Every head turned. A man stood in the doorway tall enough to nearly brush the frame shoulders, dusted white, a long coat hanging heavy and wet around his boots. He didn't rush in. He didn't announce himself. He simply stood there a moment, letting the door swing shut behind him, his eyes moving slow and deliberate across the room until they landed on the girl bleeding on the floor. Elias Boone had ridden into 100 towns just like this one. He'd learned a long time ago that the quietest rooms were often the cruelest, and that silence from a crowd was its own kind of violence. He'd seen it in army camps where men looked away while orders got given that shouldn't have been given at all. He'd walked away from that life for exactly this reason, because somewhere along the way, he'd stopped being able to stomach silence. He studied Charlotte's face, the bruise already purpling under her eye, the way her hands shook even as she tried to hold herself steady. Then his gaze slid slow and cold to Dutch Farley's raised boot. "That's enough," Elias said. His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Something in it cut through the noise of the saloon like a blade through canvas, and even Dutch twice the stranger's width in the shoulders. 3 men standing at his back felt something crawl up the base of his neck. "This ain't your business, mister," Dutch said, lowering his boot, but not releasing Charlotte's hair. "Walk on, get yourself a drink, and mind your own affairs." "Reckon I just made it my business." Elias took 1 step forward, snow melting off his coat onto the floor. His eyes never left Dutch's face. "Let go of her." Silas Rourke laughed a wet, ugly sound. "You hear this fella Dutch rides in out of the storm like he's God's own justice." He spat near Elias's boots. "Mister, you got no idea whose business you're stepping into. That's Barrett Cole's men you're looking at. I know exactly whose men you are." Elias's voice didn't change, didn't rise. "Doesn't change what I said." Bill Tanner cracked his knuckles louder this time, stepping around to flank the stranger's left side. Cody Marsh mirrored him on the right hand, hovering near his hip. 4 against 1. Good odds by any drunk man's math. Elias turned his head slow, taking in each of them in turn. Dutch, straight ahead. Silas to the left. Bill, circling right. Cody, hanging back like he wasn't quite sure yet if he had the stomach for what was coming. Elias's gaze finally settled on Amos Whitfield, the town carpenter sitting near the cold end of the stove, a half-finished chair leg forgotten in his lap. "Whitfield," Elias said without raising his voice, without so much as blinking. "Prepare 4 coffins." The saloon went dead silent. Even the wind outside seemed to hold its breath. Amos Whitfield's mouth fell open. You can't be serious, mister. There's 4 of them and 1 of you." "I counted." Elias's tone stayed flat, almost gentle, like a man discussing the weather. 4 coffins." Dutch Farley threw his head back and laughed, releasing Charlotte's hair at last, so she crumpled against the bar rail, gasping. "You hear this? This drifter thinks he's going to put 4 grown men in the ground by his lonesome." He wiped his eyes, still chuckling. "Mister, I don't know where you rode in from, but you must have left your good sense back there in the snow." "Maybe," Elias said. "Or maybe I already counted the ways this ends and I'm just being polite enough to warn a man before it happens." "Polite," Silas snorted. "That's a funny word for a man about to get himself killed." "I've been called funnier things." Charlotte, still on the floor, looked up at the stranger through the tangled hair falling across her bruised face. She didn't know him. Had never seen him before this storm blew him through that door. But something in the calm, unhurried way he held himself made her chest ache with something she hadn't felt in longer than she could remember, the faint, dangerous hope that maybe, just maybe, somebody in this cursed town was finally willing to stand between her and the men who thought they owned it. "Mister," she whispered, voice raw, "you don't have to do this. They'll kill you." Elias didn't look away from Dutch. "Ma'am, with respect, I've had worse men than these 4 try that particular notion." His jaw tightened just slightly. "None of 'em managed it." "That's so." Dutch's grin faded into something meaner. He reached for the revolver at his hip. "Well, we'll just see about—" He never finished the sentence. Elias moved before Dutch's fingers had fully closed around the grip, closing the distance in 2 long strides, and driving his forearm into Dutch's wrist, pinning the weapon useless against his own hip, while his other hand caught the big man square under the jaw. Dutch's head snapped back. He staggered into the bar glasses shattering behind him and went down hard enough to rattle the floorboards. Silas lunged, but Elias was already turning, catching the man's swinging fist in an open palm and folding Silas's arm back against its own joint until the outlaw howled and dropped to his knees, cursing through gritted teeth. Bill Tanner came in swinging wild, and Elias let the blow graze past his shoulder before answering with an elbow that sent Tanner sprawling across an overturned table chairs, clattering in every direction. Only Cody Marsh remained standing, hand shaking on his revolver, eyes wide as a spooked colt. Elias turned toward him, slow hands loose and open at his sides, no weapon drawn, none needed. "Son," Elias said quietly, "you're young enough to still walk away from this life. I'd think real hard before you pull that trigger." Cody's hand trembled. For one long, terrible breath, nobody in the saloon knew what the boy would do. Then his shoulders sagged and the revolver lowered an inch, then two, until it hung useless at his side. "That's a wise choice," Elias said, and something almost gentle moved behind his eyes. Dutch groaned from the floor, blood trickling from his split lip, glaring up with pure hatred. "You don't know what you just started, mister. Barrett Cole ain't gonna let this stand. He'll bury you and that thieving girl both. She's not a thief." Elias crouched just slightly so his eyes met Dutch's at level. "And you're gonna crawl back to your boss and tell him exactly what happened here tonight. Tell him a stranger stopped 4 grown men from beating a girl half to death over money she never touched. Tell him that stranger ain't leaving town anytime soon. You'll regret this," Dutch spat, dragging himself upright, one hand braced against the bar. Silas struggled up beside him, cradling his ruined arm, and Bill Tanner staggered to his feet, wheezing. The three of them retreated toward the door, Cody trailing behind, casting one last uncertain glance back at Charlotte, before the cold night swallowed them whole. The saloon exhaled all at once. Sheriff Higgins finally looked up from his glass, though he made no move to rise from his chair. "Mister, you just made yourself a powerful enemy." "Wouldn't be the first," Elias said, not even glancing his way. He turned instead to Charlotte, kneeling beside her with a care that felt almost foreign in a room that had only moments before watched her beaten without lifting a single hand. He didn't touch her without asking. He simply held out his palm, patient, letting her decide. "Can you stand, ma'am?" Charlotte stared at that offered hand like it might vanish if she blinked. Nobody had offered her anything in this town except suspicion and blame since the night that payroll box went missing. Slowly she reached out and let him help her to her feet, wincing at the ache blooming along her ribs. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why would you do that? You don't even know me." "Didn't need to know you," Elias said. "Just needed to see 4 men beaten on somebody who wasn't fighting back." His eyes gray as the storm still raging outside softened just slightly. "That's reason enough for most folks I've known worth calling good." "Most folks in this town ain't good," Charlotte said bitterly, glancing around at the saloon patrons already returning to their drinks, already pretending the last 5 minutes hadn't happened at all. "Most folks look the other way." "I noticed." Elias's jaw tightened again. "Reckon that's part of the problem." Pruitt, the saloon owner, finally found his voice, though he kept a careful distance. "Mister, I don't want no more trouble in my establishment. You understand Barrett Cole's men will be back, and next time, they won't come alone." "Then next time, I'll count more coffins," Elias said simply, and something in his tone left no room for argument. Charlotte studied him carefully now. The weathered lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent under harsh sun and colder skies, the quiet steadiness in his hands even after the violence they'd just delivered, the way he seemed to carry some old, unspoken weight on his shoulders that had nothing to do with tonight. "You're not from around here," she said. "I'd have remembered a man like you." "Rode in from the high country," Elias said. "Was just passing through, aimin' to be gone by mornin'." He paused, glancing toward the door where Dutch and his men had vanished into the storm. "Reckon those plans might have changed some. Because of me. Because of what I saw." His gray eyes met hers, steady and unflinching. "There's a difference, ma'am, though I understand why you might not believe that yet." Charlotte pulled her torn apron tighter around herself, suddenly aware of every eye in the saloon still watching, still whispering behind cupped hands. Shame burned hotter than the bruises on her face. "They think I stole from Mr. Cole. Payroll money gone from the ranch office. I never touched it. I swear before God I never touched it, but nobody believes me. Nobody in this whole town has believed me since the night it disappeared." "I believe you," Elias said. The simplicity of it nearly broke something loose in her chest. "You don't even know me," she said again, quieter this time. "Don't need to," he repeated. "I know cattle barons. I know how men like Barrett Cole build their fortunes not through honest work, but through fear and through blaming folks too poor and too powerless to fight back." He glanced toward the frosted window where the storm still raged white against black. "A missing payroll box is a mighty convenient excuse to come after a girl who probably knows more than she realizes. Charlotte's breath caught. What do you mean? I mean, Elias said, lowering his voice so only she could hear. Men don't send 4 hired guns to beat a confession out of somebody over a few $100s, not unless they're afraid of something bigger coming loose. His eyes searched hers, patient searching. You ever see anything in that ranch office, Miss Hayes? Charlotte Hayes. She hesitated, old fear rising cold in her throat. Memories she'd buried deep since the night she witnessed something she was never meant to see. Ledgers forged, signatures, numbers that didn't add up. Barrett Cole's voice low and threatening in the next room. She swallowed hard. I might have seen something. I don't rightly know what it means. Then maybe it's time somebody helped you figure it out, Elias said. Outside, the storm howled against the windows, rattling the glass in its frame, and somewhere beyond the reach of that fragile saloon light, 4 beaten men were already limping their way back toward Barrett Cole's ranch, carrying word of a stranger who'd walked into Red Hollow and promised, without raising his voice, without drawing a single weapon, that 4 coffins would be waiting for anyone foolish enough to test him twice. Charlotte Hayes did not know, standing there in the wreckage of a saloon and the ruins of her own reputation, that the man beside her would soon become the only thing standing between her and a war that had been building in this valley long before that winter storm ever rolled in. She only knew that for the first time in longer than she could remember, she did not feel entirely alone. Sheriff Higgins finally rose from his chair, tipping his hat low as he made for the door, unwilling to meet either of their eyes. This ain't over, he muttered more to himself than anyone else before disappearing into the cold. Elias watched him go, something hard and knowing settling behind his gray eyes. No, he said quietly, almost to himself. Reckon it surely isn't. Charlotte wrapped her arms around herself, staring at the door, where 4 dangerous men had retreated carrying threats that would not stay buried in the snow for long. Somewhere out there, in a warm ranch house lit against the storm, Barrett Cole was about to learn that his money, his fear, and his 4 hired guns had failed to silence one waitress, and had instead delivered a stranger straight into the heart of everything he'd spent years trying to hide. The storm did not break by morning. It only shifted, groaning across the mountains like some great wounded animal, and Red Hollow woke to drifts piled waist-high against every door. Charlotte Hayes had not slept. She sat in the back room of the boarding house Margaret Doyle kept for widows and orphans, staring at a single folded page, hidden inside the lining of her coat. The only piece of evidence she had managed to save the night. Everything in her life came apart. Elias Boone had not slept either. He had spent the hours before dawn walking the perimeter of the boarding house in the cold rifle loose in his hands, watching the tree line for shapes that never came. Dutch Farley and his men had retreated, but retreat was not the same as surrender. And Elias had learned a long time ago that wounded men with powerful bosses rarely stayed quiet for long. By the time gray light broke over the ridge, he came inside stomping snow from his boots, and found Charlotte already awake, already dressed, already staring at that folded page like it might catch fire in her hands. You didn't sleep, he said. Neither did you. She didn't look up. I heard you outside half the night. Somebody had to keep watch. The sheriff's supposed to do that. The sheriff, Elias said, pulling out a chair across from her, was more interested in the bottom of his glass than the safety of a girl bleeding on his own saloon floor. I wouldn't count on him for much. Charlotte's jaw tightened. She knew he was right, and the knowing tasted bitter as old coffee. She finally slid the folded page across the table, her hand trembling only slightly. This is what they're after, she said. This is why Dutch Farley near broke my jaw last night. Elias took it careful, like a man handling something that might still bite. He unfolded it, slow eyes moving line by line, and Charlotte watched his face for some sign of what he was thinking. What she saw instead was a stillness that unsettled her more than any reaction might have. Where'd you get this? He asked finally. Ranch office, 3 months back. Her voice dropped, the memory pulling something tight behind her ribs. I was delivering supper for Mr. Cole's bookkeeper, old man Findlay, and I heard voices through the door. Angry voices. Barrett Cole, and a man I didn't recognize arguing over numbers that didn't match up. She swallowed. I wasn't trying to spy, mister. I swear it. But I saw this page sitting on the desk when I stepped in, and something about it looked wrong. 2 columns of numbers for the same month telling 2 different stories. You took it. I didn't think. I just... She pressed her palms flat against the table like she could steady the memory itself. Something in my gut told me it mattered. I folded it into my apron and walked out like nothing happened, and I ain't slept easy a single night since. Elias studied the page again longer this time, his gray eyes narrowing at the columns of careful handwriting. This is payroll, he said slowly. Ranch hand wages. Look here. He turned it so she could see, tapping one column with a calloused finger. This first set of numbers, these are what the men actually earned. Full wages matches what any decent outfit would pay for a winter cattle drive. And the second column, half that. His jaw set hard. Sometimes less. Charlotte's stomach turned over. You mean he's paying men half what they're owed? I mean he's paying them the higher number on paper, keeping the difference for himself, and burning evidence before anybody thinks to ask questions. Elias set the page down with a care that betrayed how much he wanted to crush it in his fist instead. This ain't just theft, Miss Hayes. This is systematic. Somebody's been skimming wages off the backs of men who can't afford to lose a single dollar, especially not through a Wyoming winter. That's why they wanted this page gone, Charlotte whispered. That's why they came after me. That's why, Elias agreed. And I'd wager my last dollar this ain't the only crooked ledger Barrett Coles got hidden somewhere on that ranch. A knock at the door made them both go still. Charlotte's hand flew instinctively to her throat, old fear rising fast, but Elias was already on his feet, rifle raised halfway before a familiar voice called through the wood. It's Margaret, for heaven's sake. Lower that thing before you put a hole in my good door. Elias exhaled and opened it to reveal a small, sharp-eyed woman in her 60s. Silver hair, pinned tight beneath a wool bonnet, snow-dusting her shoulders. Margaret Doyle had run this boarding house for 11 years. And before that, she had spent 3 decades as a court clerk in Cheyenne, keeping records so precise that judges twice her rank had come to rely on her memory over their own paperwork. Well, Margaret said, stepping inside and shaking snow from her boots. Seems the whole town's talking about the stranger who walked into the frost lantern and near about took apart 4 of Barrett Cole's men with his bare hands. Wasn't my intention to make a spectacle, Elias said. Didn't say it was a bad thing, young man. Margaret's sharp eyes moved to Charlotte, softening considerably. You all right, child? I've been better, Charlotte admitted, managing a small, tired smile. Margaret's gaze dropped to the page still sitting on the table, and something shifted in her expression, quick and unmistakable. She crossed the room in 3 brisk steps and picked it up, studying it with the same careful precision she'd once used to catch forged signatures on land deeds back in her clerking days. Where did you get this? She asked, echoing Elias's earlier question, though her voice carried a different weight now, something closer to recognition than curiosity. Ranch office. 3 months back, Charlotte said again. Why do you know something about it? Margaret didn't answer right away. She set the page down and moved to a locked cabinet in the corner of the room, producing a small brass key from a chain around her neck. Inside, beneath a stack of folded linens, sat a modest wooden box. She carried it to the table and opened it to reveal a thin stack of yellowed papers carefully preserved, before corruption spread through this county like rot through timber. Margaret said quietly, I made copies, land records mostly. Deeds that started changing hands a little too conveniently right around the time Barrett Cole started building his empire. She pulled one sheet free and laid it beside Charlotte's page. I always suspected the payroll books were crooked too. Never had proof. Until now. Elias leaned over the table, comparing the 2 documents side by side. The handwriting matched. The same careful, deliberate hand had forged both sets of records. Findley, Charlotte breathed. The bookkeeper. It has to be him. Or somebody working under his direction, Margaret said. Either way, this confirms what I've suspected for 2 years. Barrett Cole ain't just cheating his ranch hands out of wages. He's using the same tricks to steal land. How? Elias asked, though something in his gut had already begun assembling the shape of the answer. Margaret's mouth thinned into a grim line. Debt, she said. Forged debt mostly. Widows and small ranchers get a notice saying they owe money on loans they never took out, signed with signatures that ain't quite right if you look close enough. They can't afford lawyers. They can't afford to fight a man with Barrett Cole's money and Barrett Cole's judge. She tapped the stack of land records. So they sign over their property instead, thinking it's the only way to settle the debt, and Cole picks up prime grazing land for pennies on the dollar. Charlotte's stomach turned cold. How many families? I've counted 11 confirmed cases in the last 2 years, Margaret said. I suspect there's more I haven't been able to trace. She looked up, meeting Elias's steady gray eyes. And come spring, when the ground thaws enough for surveyors to work, I believe Barrett Cole intends to push through a wave of new debt notices, forcing out every small holder still standing between him and the entire valley. The room fell silent except for the wind rattling the window panes. That's why he sent Dutch and his men after me, Charlotte said slowly, the pieces settling into place with sickening clarity. It ain't about a few $100s in missing payroll. It's about making sure nobody connects the payroll fraud to the land fraud. If one comes loose, the whole scheme unravels. Exactly, Margaret said. And a scared, disgraced waitress accused of theft makes a mighty convenient distraction from a cattle baron's crimes, don't it? Elias straightened. Jaw tight. Something cold and purposeful moving behind his eyes. Then we need more than these 2 pages, he said. We need the full ledgers. We need names, dates, every forged signature Cole's bookkeeper ever put to paper. That's easier said than done, Margaret said. Findlay keeps the real books locked in Cole's private study. Nobody gets near that room except Cole himself and maybe Findlay. Then somebody needs to get near that room, Elias said. Charlotte looked up sharply. You're not thinking of breaking into Barrett Cole's ranch house. I'm thinking exactly that. Mister, after last night, half that ranch is probably looking for you with rifles loaded. Wouldn't be the first time men went looking for me and came up empty-handed. Elias said something almost like humor flickering at the corner of his mouth, though his eyes stayed hard and serious. Margaret studied him a long moment, arms crossed. You're either the bravest man to ride into this valley in years, she said, or the most foolish. I ain't decided which yet. Maybe both, Elias allowed. Wouldn't be the first time that was true either. Outside, the wind howled fiercer, rattling loose shutters somewhere down the street, and none of them noticed the shape moving along the tree line at the edge of town, watching the boarding house with patient, calculating eyes. Barrett Cole's study smelled of leather, pipe smoke, and old money. He sat behind a mahogany desk imported all the way from Denver, listening to Dutch Farley's account of the previous night's humiliation, with a stillness that unsettled the big man more than any shouted rage might have. Say his name again, Barrett said quietly. Didn't give one Mr. Cole. Just walked in out of the storm and started swinging. Dutch shifted his weight, favoring his bruised ribs. Man fights like he's had army training. Moved too clean, too controlled, like he'd done it 100 times before, and never once broke a sweat doing it. Barrett's fingers drummed slow against the desk, each tap deliberate as a clock counting down towards something inevitable. He was a broad man in his 50s. Silver-streaked hair, combed back severe eyes, the pale gray-blue of a winter sky that had long since forgotten how to show warmth. He had built this empire from nothing, clawed his way up from a dirt-poor cattle drover to the richest man in 3 counties, and he had not done it by tolerating interference. And the girl? He said. Hayes. She's still in town. Boardin' with Margaret Doyle, last I heard. Something flickered behind Barrett's pale eyes at the mention of Margaret's name. Doyle, he repeated softly. That old clerk still causing trouble for me even after I ran her out of her position in Cheyenne. You know her, sir. I know her well enough to worry when her name turns up near my problems. Barrett rose from his chair, moving to the window that overlooked his sprawling ranch, snow, stretching white and endless toward the mountains beyond. That woman kept records so precise, a judge could have built a case off her memory alone. If she's harboring that Hayes girl, I want to know what else she's harboring. You want us to go back? Finish what we started? No. Barrett's voice sharpened, cutting off the suggestion before it fully formed. Not yet. Not with this stranger stirring up sympathy for the girl. Beat her again now, and half this town starts asking questions they've been too scared to ask for years. He turned from the window, pale eyes calculating. We need to be smarter than that. What do you have in mind, sir? Barrett moved back to his desk, pulling open a drawer and producing a thin file of papers. Judge Harmon owes me considerable favors, he said. I intend to collect on one. We'll have Charlotte Hayes formally charged with theft. Real charges, real warrant signed and sealed by a judge nobody in this county will dare question. His mouth curved into something that resembled a smile, but held none of its warmth. Let the stranger play hero all he wants. Can't very well protect a wanted fugitive without making himself one, too. Dutch's grin returned slow and satisfied. That's clever, Mr. Cole. It's necessary, Barrett corrected. And find out who this stranger is. Every man's got a pass Dutch. I want his. And if he don't back down once he learns you got the law on your side... Barrett's pale eyes went flat and cold as the ice creeping across his study window. Then we remind him exactly how far my reach extends in this valley, he said quietly. And this time, don't send 4 men to do a job that requires more permanent solutions. Word of the warrant reached Margaret's boarding house by midday, carried in on the boots of a frightened young stable hand who owed Margaret a debt of kindness from years past. They're saying Judge Harmon signed it this morning, the boy said, breathless from running through knee-deep snow. Theft charges official and everything. Sheriff's supposed to come collect Miss Hayes by nightfall. Charlotte's face drained of color. They can't do that. I never stole anything. Doesn't matter what's true, Margaret said grimly, already moving to gather what few valuables remained in her modest home. Matters what's signed and sealed. Barrett Coles had that judge in his pocket for years. Elias stood near the window, jaw tight, watching the empty street beyond. How long before the sheriff comes? Could be hours. Could be less, Margaret said. Higgins ain't got the spine to defy a signed warrant, even one he knows is dirty. Then we need to move her, Elias said. Move her where? Charlotte's voice cracked, panic finally breaking through the composure she'd held since last night. There's nowhere in this valley Barrett Cole's reach don't extend. He owns the sheriff, the judge, half the merchants on Main Street. Where exactly am I supposed to hide? The old line shack up near Widow's Ridge, Margaret said suddenly. Belonged to my late husband before he passed. Ain't been used in 3 years, but it's sound enough, and it's far enough off the main roads that Cole's men would have a devil of a time finding it in this weather. Elias nodded slow. That'll buy us time. Time enough to get to that judge in Cheyenne you mentioned, the honest one. Judge Coburn, Margaret confirmed. Federal Circuit Judge travels through the territory twice a year hearing appeals cases too big for local courts to handle alone. He's due through this region within the month, if my memory of his schedule holds true. A month, Charlotte said weakly. I'm supposed to hide in a line shack for a month while Barrett Cole hunts me like a criminal. Better than hanging for a crime you never committed? Margaret said, not unkindly, but with the bluntness of a woman who had spent decades watching injustice unfold and had long since stopped softening hard truths. Elias moved to Charlotte's side, his voice dropping low steady. I'll ride with you, he said. Won't leave you up there alone, not with Cole's men combing these hills. Charlotte looked up at him, something fragile and grateful moving behind her exhausted eyes. You don't owe me this, mister. You already put yourself between me and 4 armed men once. You don't have to keep doing it. Ma'am, Elias said quietly. I made a promise last night whether I said the words out loud or not. Ain't in my nature to break a promise once it's made. Margaret watched the exchange with sharp, knowing eyes, saying nothing. though something in her expression suggested she understood exactly what was beginning to take root between the weary drifter and the wrongly accused girl, even if neither of them had yet found the words for it themselves. "We need to move now," Elias said, straightening business, settling back into his tone. "Before that sheriff decides tonight ain't too soon to collect on a warrant." They left through the back trail behind Margaret's property, just as gray afternoon light began bleeding toward evening, Elias leading 2 horses through drifts that reached nearly to their knees. Charlotte wrapped in every spare coat and blanket Margaret could spare. The wind had died somewhat, though the cold remained bitter enough to steal breath from lungs with every gasp. "You know these hills?" Charlotte asked, teeth chattering despite her layered wrappings. "Well enough," Elias said. "Spent considerable time up in these mountains before I ever rode into Red Hollow." "Doing what?" He was quiet a moment, guiding his horse around a fallen tree, buried half beneath snow. "Trying to forget things," he said finally. "Didn't work as well as I'd hoped." Charlotte studied his profile, weathered and unreadable against the darkening sky. "What things?" "Things a man does when he's ordered to, even when every part of him knows it's wrong," Elias said, voice carrying an old, worn grief. "I was a scout for the army once. Good at my job. Too good, maybe. Followed orders 11 years without question until an order came down that I couldn't follow no matter what it cost me." "What kind of order?" Elias's jaw tightened, gray eyes fixed on the trail ahead. "Kind that gets innocent folks killed for the sake of somebody else's ambition," he said quietly. "I refused. Walked away from everything I'd built, every rank I'd earned, rather than carry it out." He glanced sideways at her. "Been driftin' ever since, trying to find some place where standin' up for what's right don't cost a man everything he's got." Charlotte absorbed this in silence, snow crunching beneath the horse's hooves, the only sound between them for several long moments. "Seems to me," she said finally, "you found that place. Or at least you're building it right here in Red Hollow." Something shifted in Elias's expression, subtle but unmistakable. "Maybe," he allowed. "Reckon we'll find out." They reached the line shack as the last gray light faded from the sky. A small, sturdy structure tucked against a rocky outcrop, nearly invisible beneath its blanket of snow. Elias worked quickly to get a fire going, while Charlotte huddled near the cold hearth, exhaustion and fear finally catching up to her all at once. "You should rest," Elias said once flames finally caught in the small stove. "Long day tomorrow getting word to Judge Coburn. How do we even find him? Margaret said he travels the territory. Could be anywhere between here and Cheyenne." "Margaret's got a contact in the territorial capital, former colleague from her clerkin' days. She'll know how to reach him, get word sent ahead." Elias settled across from her, the small fire casting flickering light across both their tired faces. "We just need to survive up here long enough for that message to travel." Charlotte pulled her knees up to her chest, staring into the flames. "And if Barrett Cole finds us first, then he'll learn exactly how many coffins a man's willin' to count for somebody worth protectin'," Elias said, quiet and certain. Charlotte looked up at him, firelight catching the exhaustion and fear still etched deep in her features. But something else too. Something warmer, more fragile. "You keep saying things like that," she said softly. "Like you'd really do it. Like you'd really put yourself between me and whatever comes next, even knowing what it might cost you." "I would," Elias said, simply, no hesitation in his voice at all. "Already have way I see it." The fire crackled between them, the only sound in the small shack besides the wind still moaning faintly outside. Charlotte felt something loosen in her chest, some tight, guarded thing she'd carried since the night Barrett Cole's men first came looking for a girl to blame for crimes far larger than any missing payroll box. "Thank you," she whispered, "for not looking away. Last night in that saloon when everybody else in this whole town found something else to look at instead of me." Elias's gray eyes held hers steady across the small fire. "Ma'am," he said, voice low and rough with something he didn't quite have words for yet. I don't reckon I could have looked away from you if I'd tried. Yeah. 3 days passed in the line shack, the cold world outside, pressing close against thin wooden walls, while inside, something quiet and unexpected continued taking root between them. Elias taught Charlotte how to check rifle sights, how to read tracks in fresh snow, small practical skills offered without pretense, without demand for anything in return. Charlotte, in turn, found herself sharing pieces of her own past. She'd never spoken aloud to another living soul. A father lost to a mining accident when she was 12, a mother who'd worked herself into an early grave trying to keep them fed, the long years of scraping by on saloon wages that were never quite enough. You ever think about leaving? Elias asked on the third evening. Both of them seated near the stove, the fire burned low and golden. Startin' somewhere new somewhere, Barrett Cole's name don't mean nothing at all. Charlotte considered this a long moment. Used to, she admitted. Used to lay awake some nights dreaming about it. Denver maybe, or further west somewhere with real opportunity for a woman willing to work hard. She glanced at him, firelight catching something thoughtful in her tired eyes. But something changed, I think. Watching Margaret fight for justice all these years, quiet as she's had to be about it. Watching you walk into that saloon without a second thought for your own safety. Her voice softened. Makes we wonder if maybe staying and fighting matters more than running towards somewhere easier. Fightin's a hard road, Elias said quietly. I'd know. Was it worth it? Walking away from the army? I mean, even knowing everything it cost you. Elias was quiet a long moment, staring into the low flames. Some nights I still ain't sure, he admitted, voice rough with old honesty. But then I think about the alternative, following that order, living with what it would have made of me. He shook his head slow. No, ma'am. Some prices are worth paying, even when they cost everything a man thought he wanted. Charlotte reached out hesitant and rested her hand lightly over his rough, calloused one. I'm glad you walked away, she said softly. Glad it brought you here. To Red Hollow. To that saloon door right when it mattered most. Elias turned his hand beneath hers, fingers curling gentle around her own, something warm and unspoken passing between them in the firelight. Reckon I am too, ma'am, he said quietly. Reckon I surely am. Outside, the wind had finally begun to still the worst of the storm, passing on toward some other unfortunate stretch of territory, leaving Red Hollow buried beneath fresh silence and deep drifts of snow. But even as that fragile, quiet moment stretched between them, inside the small shack, neither Charlotte nor Elias noticed the faint flicker of torchlight, moving slow and deliberate along the ridge above, drawing steadily closer through the darkness. Back in Red Hollow, Sheriff Wade Higgins sat in his office long after nightfall, the signed warrant for Charlotte Hayes's arrest resting heavy on his desk like an accusation of its own. He had not gone looking for her, had not ridden out to Margaret Doyle's boarding house, had not sent word to Barrett Cole's ranch confirming the girl's whereabouts remained unknown. He told himself it was strategy patience waiting for a better opportunity. The truth, if he'd allowed himself to examine it honestly, was closer to shame. A knock at his office door interrupted these unwelcome thoughts. He opened it to find Barrett Cole himself, standing in the cold, flanked by two men Higgins didn't recognize. Their coats too fine, their eyes too sharp for simple ranch hands. Mr. Cole, Higgins said, straightening despite himself. Wasn't expecting you tonight. I'm told the warrant remains unserved, Barrett said, stepping past the sheriff into the small office without waiting for invitation. 3 days now, Sheriff. Seems like a considerable delay for a lawman with a signed order in hand. Storms made travel difficult, Mr. Cole. Roads are near impassable in half the county. Is that so? Barrett's pale eyes swept the small office cold and assessing. Or is it possible, Sheriff, that you're finding this particular assignment less appealing than your others? Perhaps some lingering discomfort about arresting an innocent girl on manufactured charges. Higgins's throat went dry. I never said that, Mr. Cole. No, Barrett agreed softly. You didn't. but your feet have said it plenty these past 3 days. He moved closer, voice dropping to something quiet and dangerous. Let me be clear, Sheriff. I did not build this empire by tolerating hesitation from men who owe me their positions, their livelihoods, and frankly their continued good health in this county. You will find that girl. You will serve that warrant. And you will do it before Judge Coburn's circuit brings him anywhere near this territory. Because I promise you, Sheriff, if that girl or that stranger manage to reach Coburn before I resolve this matter, the consequences will extend considerably beyond your badge. Higgins swallowed hard, old fear settling cold and familiar in his gut. I'll find her, Mr. Cole. Give me 2 more days. You have 1, Barrett said, turning toward the door. And Sheriff, I'd suggest bringing more than your own courage this time. That stranger's proven considerably more dangerous than 4 of my best men anticipated. I won't tolerate further embarrassment. The door closed behind him, leaving Higgins alone in the cold, quiet office, the weight of an impossible choice settling heavier across his shoulders with every passing second. Dawn broke clear and bitter cold over Widow's Ridge sunlight, glinting hard off fresh snow, when Elias woke to the sound of horses moving through the trees below the line shack. He was on his feet instantly, rifle in hand, moving to the small window with the careful practiced silence of a man who had spent years learning to read danger before it fully announced itself. Charlotte, he said, quietly urgent. Wake up, now. She startled awake, fear flooding her expression, as she took in his rigid posture, the rifle held steady in his grip. What is it? Riders, coming up the North Trail. He counted through the frosted glass jaw tightening with each figure that emerged from the tree line. 6 of them, sheriff's leadin', and I count at least 2 more of Cole's hired guns among the rest. How did they find us? Don't know. Don't matter now. Elias moved quickly, gathering what supplies he could into a single pack, urgency sharpening every motion. There's a back trail, steeper but faster, leads down toward the old mining road. We move now, we might get enough head start to lose him in the rocks. Charlotte's hands shook as she pulled her coat tight, fear and adrenaline warring visibly across her face. And if we don't lose him, Elias met her eyes, gray and steady, even now, even with 6 armed men closing in through the snow. Then I'll count however many coffins the day requires, he said quietly. But I'd rather not test that particular math if we don't have to. Move, Charlotte, now. They slipped out the shack's rear entrance just as the first riders crested the ridge above, shouts already carrying faint across the cold morning air, and Elias pulled Charlotte into a hard run down the steep, treacherous back trail, snow flying beneath their boots, the sound of pursuing horses growing louder with every desperate, gasping breath. The line shack, empty now, stood silent behind them as Sheriff Higgins and Barrett Cole's men descended upon it minutes later, finding only cold ashes in the stove and fresh tracks leading down toward the mining road below, tracks that within the hour would lead them directly into an ambush. Neither Elias nor Charlotte had planned, but one that would change the entire course of the war, quietly building across Red Hollow's frozen valley. The back trail dropped fast beneath their boots, ice-slick rock giving way to loose scree, and Charlotte's breath tore ragged from her lungs as she fought to keep pace with Elias's longer stride. Behind them, the shouts of 6 riders grew sharper, closer, carried clean across the cold morning air by a wind that seemed determined to betray every step they took. They're gainin', Charlotte gasped. I know. Elias caught her elbow, steadying her over a patch of black ice before it could send her sprawling. Down toward that ridgeline, there's a break in the rock narrow enough only 1 horse can pass through at a time. We reach it first, we can hold 'em there long enough to lose ourselves in the canyon beyond. And if we don't reach it first, we will. They didn't. The riders crested the slope above, just as Elias and Charlotte broke into the open stretch before the rock break, and Sheriff Higgins' voice rang out across the snow, hoarse with something that might have been reluctance, dressed up as authority. Hold there, Charlotte Hayes. I got a warrant for your arrest signed by Judge Harmon himself. Don't make this harder than it's got to be. Elias pushed Charlotte behind him without breaking stride, angling his body between her and the 6 mounted men now fanning out along the ridge above. Higgins, he called back, voice level despite the burn in his own lungs. You know that warrant's dirty. You knew it 3 days ago when Cole handed it to you, and you know it now." "Don't matter what I know," Higgins shouted back, though something in his tone wavered. "Matters what's signed. Funny how that works out real convenient for men like Barrett Cole." Elias's gray eyes swept the ridge, counting positions, counting rifles, counting the seconds it would take each man to close the distance if it came to that. Two of Cole's hired guns flanked Higgins on either side, faces Elias didn't recognize from the saloon, which meant Cole had brought in fresh muscle since the beating 3 nights past. "You planning on shooting an unarmed woman in the back, Sheriff? Because that's what it'll take to serve that warrant today. Nobody said anything about shooting her." "Then what exactly did you have in mind, riding 6 deep after one girl and one drifter?" Higgins's jaw worked some old shame flickering visible even at this distance. Before he could answer, one of Cole's hired men, a lean, hard-eyed man with a scar cutting through his left eyebrow, spurred his horse forward without waiting for orders. "Enough talking," the man growled, drawing his rifle. "Cole didn't send us up here to negotiate." The shot cracked across the frozen valley before Elias had fully registered the man's intent, snow kicking up inches from Charlotte's boots. She screamed, stumbling backward, and Elias was already moving, shoving her hard toward the rock break, even as he drew his own weapon and returned fire, forcing the scarred gunman to wheel his horse hard behind cover. "Go!" Elias shouted. "Through the break now." Charlotte scrambled through the narrow gap in the rock, heart hammering so violent she could hear nothing else over its rhythm. While behind her, the valley erupted into chaos, shouted orders. More gunfire, the panicked whinny of startled horses. She turned back just long enough to see Elias backing through the gap after her rifle still raised, gray eyes hard and focused in a way that made her chest ache with a fear that had nothing to do with the men chasing them. "Keep moving," he barked. "Don't stop for anything." They ran. The canyon beyond the rock, break twisted narrow and treacherous walls of stone, rising steep on either side, and Elias used every inch of that terrain like a man reading familiar scripture, guiding Charlotte through switchbacks and hidden turns that would cost their pursuers precious minutes even mounted. Behind them, the sound of horses forced to dismount and navigate the rock break on foot bought them the head start they desperately needed. They didn't stop running until the canyon finally opened onto a wide, snow-blanketed meadow nearly a mile distant, both of them gasping, Charlotte's legs threatening to buckle beneath her. "We lost them," she managed between ragged breaths. "Didn't we? We lost them." For now. Elias scanned the tree line behind them, rifle still ready in his grip. "Won't stay lost long, not with Higgins knowing these hills near as well as I do. Where do we go? Margaret's boarding house ain't safe anymore, not with a warrant out, and Higgins willing to hunt us through a blizzard." Elias was quiet a moment, calculating, and Charlotte watched something settle hard and decided behind his gray eyes. "There's a trapper's cabin 2 hours west, belonged to a man I knew during my scouting days. Abandoned now, but sound enough to shelter us till dark." He glanced at her, something protective and fierce moving behind his exhaustion. "We rest there. Then tonight, under cover of dark, we make for the territorial road. Margaret's contact should have word to Judge Coburn by now. We just need to survive long enough to reach him." "Survive," Charlotte repeated hollowly. "Feels like that word's been doing an awful lot of work these past few days." "I know it." Elias's voice softened, just slightly weariness, and something gentler mixing together beneath the hard edges of his exhaustion. "I'm sorry you got dragged into this, Charlotte. Wasn't fair what happened to you. Ain't fair now either. Wasn't your doing." She managed a tired, trembling smile. "You're the only fair thing that's happened to me since that payroll box went missing." Something passed between them, then quiet and unspoken before Elias nodded toward the tree line ahead. "Come on. Trapper's cabin ain't gonna reach itself." "Come." They reached the cabin as afternoon light began bleeding gray toward evening exhaustion, finally catching up with both of them in full. Elias barred the door, checked the single window twice, and only then allowed himself to sit rifle still within easy reach while Charlotte huddled near the cold hearth, too tired even to shiver properly. "You should eat something," Elias said, producing what little remained of their supplies. "Long night ahead. Charlotte took the offered jerky without much enthusiasm, chewing mechanically, while her mind raced through everything that had happened, everything still ahead. "Elias," she said finally, "if something happens to me tonight, if Higgins catches up or Cole's men find us first, ain't gonna happen, but if it does—" She held his gaze steady despite the fear still trembling beneath her voice. "I need you to promise me something. That page, the evidence. You'll make sure it reaches Judge Coburn no matter what happens to me." Elias's jaw tightened, something fierce and immovable settling into his expression. "Nothing's gonna happen to you, Charlotte. I already told you I made a promise the night I walked into that saloon. Elias, I mean it." He moved closer, kneeling before her gray eyes intense in the dim cabin light. "I've buried enough good people in my life, Charlotte. Watched enough innocent folks pay for other men's crimes. I ain't adding your name to that list. Not while there's breath left in me to prevent it." Charlotte's eyes burned exhaustion and fear, and something warmer all tangling together in her chest. "Why do you care so much? You barely know me. Maybe I don't need to know your whole history to know you're worth fighting for," Elias said quietly. "Maybe that's been enough for me since the moment I walked through that saloon door and saw you refusing to give those men the satisfaction of watching you break." She reached out, then fingers trembling as they brushed against his weathered jaw, and for a long suspended moment, neither of them moved, the small fire crackling low between them. The world outside forgotten entirely. The sound of approaching horses shattered the moment entirely. Elias was on his feet instantly, rifle raised, moving to the window with the same lethal focus that had carried him through countless dangerous nights before this one. Charlotte scrambled up behind him, heart hammering fresh and frantic. "How many?" she whispered. "Too many." Elias's voice had gone flat, cold, calculating. Through the frosted glass he counted 8 riders, now torches burning bright against the deepening dusk, closing steady around the small cabin's perimeter. "They found us." "How?" "Don't matter now." He turned, grabbing her by the shoulders, urgency sharp in every line of his body. "Listen to me. There's a root cellar beneath the floorboards. Trapper used it for storage. You need to hide there now, and you don't come out no matter what you hear. You understand me? I'm not leaving you to face 8 men alone." "Charlotte, no." Her voice cracked, fierce and desperate. "I already lost everything else in this town. I ain't losing you too." Before Elias could argue further, a voice rang out from beyond the cabin walls, cold and unmistakably familiar. "Elias Boone." Barrett Cole called, his voice carrying easy across the snow. "I do believe it's time we finally made proper introductions." Elias's blood went cold. Barrett Cole himself riding out personally into the frozen hills after dark meant this had escalated far beyond hired muscle and warrants. This meant the cattle baron had decided the situation required his own direct involvement, and men like Barrett Cole did not involve themselves personally unless they intended to finish something completely. "Cole!" Elias called back, moving Charlotte firmly behind him despite her protest. "Didn't expect you to dirty your own boots out here in the cold. Some matters require a personal touch." Barrett's voice carried closer now, and through the window Elias could make out the cattle baron dismounting, flanked by Dutch Farley, and at least 6 other armed men torches, casting long, dangerous shadows across the snow. "You've caused me considerable inconvenience these past few days, Mr. Boone. Cost me valuable time, damaged 4 of my best men, and now I understand you've been assisting Miss Hayes in evading a legally signed warrant. That warrant's about as legal as your bookkeeping, Cole." Silence fell outside, heavy and dangerous, before Barrett's voice returned colder, now stripped of its earlier civility. "I don't know what that girl told you," he said, "but I'd advise considerable caution before repeating baseless accusations you can't possibly prove." "Can't I?" Elias's gray eyes hardened. "Payroll fraud, forged land deeds, 11 confirmed cases of widows and small ranchers cheated out of property through manufactured debt. That's a considerable list of accusations for a man who claims they're baseless, Cole." A long, telling silence stretched outside the cabin walls before Barrett's voice returned, quieter, now more dangerous for its restraint. "That girl has quite the imagination," he said, "combined apparently with your own eagerness to believe whatever sympathetic story a pretty face offers you." "I've seen the evidence myself," Elias said. Margaret Doyle's records match Charlotte's page near perfect. Same forged handwriting on both. Another silence, longer this time, and when Barrett spoke again, something had shifted in his tone, calculation replacing his earlier confidence. "I see," he said slowly. "That old woman's been keeping copies. Should have dealt with her years ago." A pause. "No matter. Records can be destroyed, Mr. Boone. Witnesses can be silenced. And drifters who insert themselves into affairs that don't concern them tend to disappear into these mountains without anyone asking too many questions. That a threat, Cole? It's a fact." Barrett's voice hardened further. "Send the girl out unharmed, and I'll consider letting you ride away from this valley with your life intact. Continue this foolishness, and I promise you, Mr. Boone, you won't survive to see mornin'." Charlotte's hand found Elias's arm gripping tight. "Don't," she whispered. "Don't you dare consider it." "Wasn't considering it," Elias murmured back low enough only she could hear before raising his voice toward the door. "Here's my answer, Cole. Charlotte Hayes ain't guilty of nothing but witnessing your crimes. I ain't handing her over to men who'll make sure she never testifies against you. You want her, you're gonna have to come through me first." "That can be arranged," Barrett said coldly. "Dutch." The first shot shattered through the cabin's single window, and chaos erupted. Elias dropped low, dragging Charlotte down with him, as splintered glass and gunfire tore through the small structure, the wooden walls offering only marginal protection against 8 armed men now converging from every direction. He returned fire through the shattered window, forcing back the nearest attacker, while Charlotte pressed herself flat against the floorboards, terror closing tight around her throat. "The root cellar!" Elias shouted over the gunfire. "Now, Charlotte, please!" This time, she didn't argue, scrambling toward the loose floorboard he'd shown her earlier, dropping down into the cramped darkness below, just as the cabin door splintered inward under the combined weight of 2 attackers. Elias spun, rifle raised, dropping the first man before he'd fully crossed the threshold, but the second grappled him hard, driving him back against the overturned table. The fight that followed was brutal close quarters. Every advantage of Elias's training tested against a man clearly no stranger to violence himself. They crashed through what remained of the cabin's meager furniture, fists and elbows, finding their marks in the dim, chaotic light, until Elias finally drove his opponent hard against the stone hearth, ending the fight with a final decisive blow. Outside, the gunfire continued, and through the shattered window, Elias caught sight of Barrett Cole himself, directing his remaining men with cold, calculated precision, clearly unwilling to risk his own safety while hired guns did the dangerous work. "Boone," Dutch's voice bellowed from somewhere near the tree line. "This ends now." Elias reloaded with practiced speed, gray eyes hard and focused, despite the blood trickling from a cut above his brow. He had faced worse odds than this, in his scouting days had survived ambushes that should have killed him twice over, but never before had the stakes felt quite this personal, quite this urgent. Below the floorboards, Charlotte pressed her hands over her mouth, muffling the sound of her own terrified breathing, listening to gunfire and shouted threats she couldn't fully make sense of, praying with everything left in her that Elias would somehow survive what sounded increasingly like a battle no single man could win. The gunfire outside suddenly stopped. Silence fell heavy and unnatural across the frozen clearing, and Charlotte's heart seized with dread at what that silence might mean. Then, Barrett Cole's voice rang out again, closer, now unmistakably triumphant. "Mr. Boone," he called, "I do believe we've reached something of an impasse. My men have you surrounded. You're wounded, outnumbered, and frankly, I'm growing tired of this particular inconvenience." A pause, deliberate and cruel. "Send the girl out now, and perhaps I'll still consider mercy toward you both. Continue resisting, and I promise you we'll simply burn this cabin to the ground with both of you still inside it." Elias's jaw tightened, gray eyes flicking toward the loose floorboard where Charlotte remained hidden. He had perhaps 3 shots left in his current chamber. 4 armed men still visible through what remained of the shattered window, and Barrett Cole's threat carrying weight enough that Elias didn't doubt for a moment the cattle baron's willingness to follow through. "Cole," he called back, voice steady, despite the blood still trickling warm down his temple. "You burn this cabin. You burn whatever evidence might still be inside it. Seems a mighty foolish way to protect yourself from federal charges." A brief hesitation calculation clearly working behind Barrett's cold facade. "Evidence can be recreated to suit whatever story serves me best," he said finally, though something in his tone suggested the threat had landed regardless. "But I'm a reasonable man, Mr. Boone. Let's negotiate instead of burning down a perfectly good structure needlessly. I'm listening. The evidence Miss Hayes claims to possess. Bring it to me directly along with whatever copies that Doyle woman's been hoarding, and I'll consider this entire unfortunate business concluded. No more warrants, no more pursuit. You and the girl ride out of this valley free and clear." Elias didn't believe that promise for a single second, and something in Barrett's tone suggested Cole didn't expect him to. This was a stall, a calculated attempt to draw them out into the open, where Cole's remaining men could finish what gunfire alone hadn't managed. But it also bought precious time Elias intended to use. "I need to discuss this with Miss Hayes," he called back. "Give us a few minutes." "You have 5, Barrett replied coldly. "My patience for this particular inconvenience grows thinner by the moment." Elias moved quickly to the loose floorboard, pulling it open to find Charlotte's frightened eyes staring up at him from the cramped darkness below. "You heard?" "Every word," she whispered. "You're not actually considering handing over the evidence." "No!" Elias helped her climb back up, urgency sharp in his movements. "But I am considering buying us enough time to get you out of here while Cole's men remain distracted." "And you? What happens to you while I'm escaping?" "I'll manage." "Elias!" Charlotte gripped his arm, fierce fear and determination mixing equal measure across her exhausted features. "I already told you I ain't losing you. Not after everything. There has to be another way." Elias's gray eyes softened just slightly, even amid the desperate urgency of their circumstances. "There's a back window," he said finally. "Small, but you're small enough to fit through it. Cole's men are focused on the front and the door. If I can create enough distraction, you might have a chance to slip out unnoticed, make for the tree line, and circle around toward the territorial road. And leave you here alone, against however many men Cole's got left. Charlotte, listen to me." He cupped her face gentle between his rough hands, gray eyes intense and pleading. "That evidence needs to reach Judge Coburn. You're the only one who can make that happen now. I'll hold them here as long as I can buy you the time you need." Tears burned hot in Charlotte's eyes, fear and grief tangling together at the thought of leaving him behind to face such impossible odds alone. "I can't," she whispered. "I can't just leave you to die." "You're not leaving me to die," Elias said fiercely. "You're giving every family Barrett Cole's cheated a chance at justice. You're giving Margaret's years of quiet fighting meaning. And you're giving me something worth fighting for beyond just surviving one more night." His thumb brushed gentle across her cheek, catching a tear before it could fall. "Please, Charlotte, trust me on this." A long, agonized moment passed between them before Charlotte finally nodded, fresh resolve hardening beneath her fear. "You come find me," she said fiercely. "Whatever happens tonight, you find your way back to me. That's my condition." "I intend to," Elias said, something fierce and tender mixing together in his gray eyes. "You've got my word." They moved quickly, then Elias guiding her toward the small back window, while outside, Barrett Cole's voice called out again, patience clearly thinning. "Your 5 minutes are up, Mr. Boone." "Almost ready, Cole," Elias called back, boosting Charlotte toward the narrow opening. "Just securing the evidence for you." Charlotte squeezed through the tight space, dropping silent into the snow beyond, casting one last desperate glance back toward the cabin before disappearing into the tree line's shadowy cover exactly as Elias had instructed. Inside, Elias turned back toward the shattered front window. Rifle raised, gray eyes hard and calculating as he prepared to buy whatever time remained necessary for Charlotte's escape to succeed. "Cole," he called out, Change my mind about that negotiation. A frustrated curse carried back from beyond the tree line, followed immediately by renewed gunfire, tearing through what little remained of the cabin's structure. Elias dropped low, returning fire with calculated precision, dropping one more of Cole's hired guns before a fresh wave of bullets forced him back behind the stone hearth's meager protection. Charlotte ran until her lungs burned raw, until the sound of gunfire behind her faded into distant muffled echoes carried thin across the frozen valley. She didn't stop, couldn't stop, every instinct screaming at her to keep moving, despite the tears freezing cold against her cheeks, despite the desperate fear clawing at her chest, with every step that carried her further from Elias and whatever fate awaited him back at that shattered cabin. She reached the territorial road as full darkness finally settled across the valley, exhausted and half-frozen. And it was there, collapsed against a snowdrift boulder trying to catch her breath, that she heard the approach of a single rider, moving slow and careful along the empty road. Fear seized her fresh, and she scrambled for whatever cover the darkness might offer, until a familiar voice called out soft into the night. "Charlotte? Charlotte Hayes. Is that you?" She recognized the voice, instantly relief flooding through her exhausted body. "Margaret." Margaret Doyle dismounted quickly, wrapping Charlotte in a fierce, protective embrace the moment she confirmed the girl's identity. "Thank the Lord," she breathed. "I've been riding these roads half the night praying I'd find you before Cole's men did. Where's Elias?" Charlotte's composure finally broke entirely, sobs racking through her exhausted frame. "The cabin," she managed between broken breaths. "Cole found us. 8 men, maybe more. Elias stayed behind, drew their fire so I could escape. Margaret, I don't know if he's—" "Hush now." Margaret's grip tightened, steady and reassuring, despite her own visible concern. "That man survived things far worse than 8 of Barrett Cole's hired guns, if half of what I suspect about his army days holds true. We need to focus on what matters most right now. Do you still have the evidence?" Charlotte's hand flew instinctively to her coat relief, washing through her at finding the folded page still secure where she'd hidden it. "I have it." "Good. My contact reached Judge Coburn 2 days past. He's agreed to divert his circuit through Red Hollow, directly should arrive within 2 days' time." Margaret helped Charlotte onto her horse, urgency sharpening every movement. "We need to reach town, get you somewhere safe, and pray that Elias survives long enough to reunite with us once Coburn arrives." "I can't just leave him out there, Margaret." "You're not leaving him," Margaret said firmly. "You're doing exactly what he sacrificed himself to make possible. Don't let that sacrifice mean nothing, child. We ride for town, we secure that evidence properly, and we trust that man to find his way back to you just as he promised." Charlotte nodded, fresh tears freezing against her cheeks, and together they turned toward Red Hollow, racing against a darkness that held no promises about what fate had befallen the man who'd walked into a saloon 4 nights past, and promised 4 coffins to anyone foolish enough to test him. Back at the shattered cabin, Elias fought with everything years of army training had ever taught him, gray eyes hard and focused, despite the growing exhaustion pulling heavy at every muscle. 2 more of Cole's men lay wounded or unconscious in the snow beyond the ruined doorway, but 4 still remained, along with Barrett Cole himself, now taking cover behind a fallen log at the clearing's edge. "You're outnumbered, Boone," Dutch Farley shouted, nursing a fresh wound to his shoulder from Elias's earlier fire. "Surrender now, maybe Cole shows you mercy." "Funny," Elias called back, reloading with practiced speed despite his exhaustion. "Mercy ain't exactly the word I'd associate with a man who beats innocent girls and burns cabins with people inside 'em." A fresh volley of gunfire answered his taunt, and Elias pressed himself flat against the cabin's remaining wall, calculating his rapidly diminishing options. He had perhaps 2 shots remaining, 4 armed men still active in the clearing, and no clear path toward escape that wouldn't leave him fully exposed to their combined fire. This was, he acknowledged grimly, precisely the kind of impossible odds he'd faced and survived numerous times during his scouting days. It was also, he recognized with equal clarity, entirely possible that tonight might finally be the night his luck ran out completely. "Last chance, Boone," Barrett called from behind his cover. "Surrender now, or we burn this cabin regardless of what evidence might be lost in the process." Elias's mind raced, searching for any advantage the terrain or circumstances might offer. Then through the shattered window, he spotted it, a narrow gap between two of Cole's remaining gunmen, wide enough that a sudden desperate charge might carry him through their combined fire and into the tree line beyond, buying himself the same escape route Charlotte had used earlier. It was by any reasonable calculation a suicidal gambit. But reasonable calculations had never been Elias Boone's particular specialty when the alternative meant certain death regardless. "Cole!" he shouted. "You want this evidence so bad, come get it yourself." Then he moved, breaking from cover in a desperate sprint toward the tree line, rifle blazing, as he forced Cole's remaining men to scatter for their own protection rather than risk a clean shot at a moving target. Bullets tore past him, one grazing hot across his shoulder, but he kept moving, kept running, until the darkness of the tree line finally swallowed him whole, leaving Barrett Cole's furious shouts echoing impotent across the frozen clearing behind him. "Find him!" Barrett bellowed. "I want that man dead before sunrise. Do you understand me? Dead." But the mountains that had once been Elias Boone's home for years of scouting work closed protective around him now, and by the time Cole's remaining men organized any coherent pursuit, their quarry had already vanished entirely into terrain he knew infinitely better than they ever would. 2 days passed in tense, fragile uncertainty. Charlotte remained hidden within Red Hollow's small church, the one building in town. Barrett Cole's influence had never quite managed to fully corrupt, while Margaret worked tirelessly to prepare every piece of evidence for Judge Coburn's imminent arrival. Word had spread through town by now, quiet whispers carrying tale of the stranger who'd fought off 8 of Cole's men single-handed before vanishing into the mountains, and something had begun shifting subtly beneath Red Hollow's frightened silence. Small sparks of courage kindling in townspeople who'd spent years too afraid to voice their own suspicions about Barrett Cole's empire. Charlotte barely slept, barely ate, consumed entirely by fear for Elias's fate, and desperate hope that he might yet honor the promise he'd made her. It was on the evening of the second day, as she sat huddled near the small church's modest hearth, that a soft knock sounded against the back door, careful and deliberate, in a rhythm that made her heart leap fierce with recognition. She threw open the door to find Elias standing there, exhausted and wounded, blood dried dark against his shoulder, where Dutch's bullet had grazed him, but alive, unmistakably, gloriously alive. "You came back." She breathed relief and joy, overwhelming every fear she'd carried these past 2 agonizing days. "Told you I would." Elias managed a tired, weary smile despite his obvious exhaustion. "Took the scenic route, but I made it." Charlotte pulled him inside immediately, fussing over his wound with trembling hands, even as tears of relief streamed freely down her cheeks. "I thought you might have—" "I know." He caught her hands gentle between his own gray eyes, soft with something that had grown steadily between them these past desperate days. "I'm sorry for the worry I caused you. Wasn't my intention to have you frightened these past 2 days." "You promised you'd find your way back to me," Charlotte said fiercely. "I held on to that promise every single hour you were gone." "And here I am," Elias said quietly. "Exactly as promised." Margaret appeared, then relief evident across her sharp features at finding Elias alive, and returned. "Thank the Lord," she said. "Judge Coburn arrives tomorrow morning. We need every piece of evidence properly organized before he does." Elias nodded, though something calculating had already begun working behind his tired gray eyes. "Cole knows we're gathering evidence for Coburn's arrival," he said. "He won't sit idle while we prepare to present it. Man like that, cornered and desperate, tends toward increasingly dangerous choices." "What are you thinking?" Charlotte asked. "I'm thinking Barrett Cole's about to make one final desperate move," Elias said grimly. "And we need to be ready for whatever form that takes." He was right. The following morning, as pale winter sunlight finally broke clear across Red Hollow's frozen streets, Barrett Cole's men descended upon the town in force, rounding up every resident at gunpoint and herding them toward the Frost Lantern Saloon with brutal efficiency. Charlotte watched in horror from the church's hidden vantage point as Dutch Farley dragged Margaret Doyle bodily through the snow, the old woman's sharp protests silenced by a rough hand across her mouth. "They're taken hostages." Elias breathed, gray eyes hard and calculating. "Cole's making his final play before Coburn arrives." Within the hour, Barrett Cole's voice rang out across the town square, amplified by the desperate silence of dozens of frightened townspeople now held captive within the saloon's walls. Elias Boone, Charlotte Hayes. "I know you're both still hiding somewhere in this town. You have exactly 1 hour to bring me every piece of evidence you've gathered, or I start executing one hostage every 15 minutes until my demands are met." Charlotte's blood ran cold. "He wouldn't." "He would," Elias said grimly. "Man's got nothing left to lose now, not with Coburn arriving within hours. This is his last chance to destroy the evidence before it reaches federal jurisdiction." "Then what do we do?" Elias was quiet a long moment, calculating, gray eyes, distant with the particular focus Charlotte had come to recognize as the mind of a former Army scout, assessing impossible odds and finding somehow a path through them regardless. "We give him exactly what he's asking for," Elias said finally. "Just not in the way he's expectin'." Charlotte's mind raced exhaustion, warring against fresh, desperate